Anderson Cooper, AC 360, CNN weeknights 10 Eastern.
Jeffrey, if you could explain for a second, because I was reading quite a bit about this. The Justice Department is making the case that this law violates the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. Federal law outweighs state law. Can you explain exactly what this means?
Right. You know, it's funny because most of the time that we've been talking about this law, we've been talking about does it violate Hispanic citizens or immigrants' rights by racial profiling. But that's not the claim that the Obama administration makes. They make the claim that immigration law is uniquely the preserve of the federal government. And under the so-called Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, when there is a conflict between federal law and state law, federal law is supreme. So basically what the Obama administration says in this lawsuit is that this is an attempt by Arizona to interfere with a uniquely federal function, and therefore it's unconstitutional.
So with regard to immigration, Jeff, really quickly, they say immigration law should come under the federal government because it's a combination of not only immigration but humanitarian principles, foreign policy. Is that why it should be a federal thing as opposed to state?
That's right. Anything that relates to foreign policy, that relates to relations with other countries, that is considered very much the province of the federal government as opposed to a state government. What makes this an interesting lawsuit and not a slam dunk for either side is that immigration traditionally has been an area where there's been a lot of cooperation between state governments and federal governments. True, federal law is preeminent usually, but it's not an area like war and peace, which is completely the province of the federal government. So I think it's not an easy case for the judge that gets it, but you know, both sides have a plausible claim here.
And to just in completeness here, after the law was passed, Sheriff, in Arizona, it was altered to basically say, look, there can be no racial profiling based on this law specifically. You say the law is simply a response to the fact that the federal government has dropped the ball when it comes to illegal immigration. But does it make sense, however, to have various states, as Jeff's sort of alluding to, have this sort of patchwork of laws when it comes to immigration as opposed to a more national policy? Sheriff?
Well, you're right, Sanjay. If the federal government did what they explained in great detail in this brief about the Supremacy Clause and that this is our job, well, do your job. Secure the border. Enforce the laws of the land. And if we had done that, we're talking about not just 100,000 people here that are coming in illegally. We're talking the Border Patrol, their numbers say in excess of 500,000 just here in Arizona. So if we had 500,000 or 1 million people that we sent, say let's send them to Chicago where the president's from, how quickly would this problem be addressed? And so this has been looked at as a political issue as opposed to a national security and a public safety issue for the state of Arizona. And for us, this is not an immigration law. This is a Arizona law, which is a Class 1 misdemeanor for trespassing.
And you know, with regard to this specifically, Jeff, is there a precedent to how this ends up getting resolved? I mean, how do you see this playing out now?
Well, I think this is going to go up the appeals chain. I mean, I think this is going to go to the district court in Arizona first, but it is likely then to be appeals to the Circuit Court of Appeals and very likely to the Supreme Court. You know, I'd like to take issue a little bit with what the sheriff said. You know, just because the federal government has not been fully successful in immigration, that's not necessarily a legal justification for overruling the Supremacy Clause. If, for example, Mexico was really, crossing the border and doing terrible things to people in Arizona, that wouldn't be Arizona's right to declare war on Mexico. The law says there are certain areas that are just reserved for the federal government, and even if the federal government isn't doing the best job at it.
Well,
what do you say to that, Sheriff?
Not only I disagree. For years, people have been saying that this is the federal government's problem. Well, hello, this is my obligation to protect the citizens and families in my county, and that this is directly tied to a public safety issue. Now, the federal government has failed in their obligations to secure the border. Just a few months ago, they're saying the border isn't secured. Then they move a little bit and say, hey, we'll send you 1,200 soldiers split among 4 border states. And then they didn't even read our law. Eric Holder, the president, even Napolitano didn't read the law, yet they immediately rushed to judgment, attacked us, undermined the rule of law, and said guess who's in the crosshairs now? We are. The cops who already have a tough job doing our job in Arizona, and they made it that much more difficult when they give an example of a Hispanic male and their daughter or son walking down Main Street. The president did this with an ice cream cone, and then a police officer comes up and demands papers from that man. That would never happen. That we have a Constitution, we have Fourth Amendment rights that protect and safeguard against unlawful search and seizure. I have over 200 of my staff that are Hispanic. You know, what are we talking about here?
Right. Sheriff, let me just interrupt you for 1 second. You did say this is a public safety issue to some extent. I'm sure you've read some of the same studies that I have that said the crime rates in Arizona have actually been falling despite the presence of undocumented immigrants. I mean, the numbers have gone down over the last few years, well before this law was ever passed.
Yes.
Is that really a justification for this law?
Yeah, absolutely, because we're talking not just the volume that I shared about 241,000 that were apprehended, 500,000 to 1 million that are coming into our state, which is a direct threat. That just last year, people are saying that crime rates and everything have gone down nationally, and that is true. The illegal numbers have gone down substantially over past years because of some of the gains that have been made through President Clinton, giving him great credit, President Bush. But now we have, still in Arizona, just last year, we became and earned the title of the kidnap capital of America, second in the world only to Mexico City. And so we're seeing violence here that is still not seen throughout the rest of the world, and we're living in the impact and the effect, and we're asking for help. You wouldn't have a sheriff and all of our police chiefs in our county calling for armed soldiers to Arizona if we could handle this on our own.